So, William, just a couple of quick questions before you speak to us. Just wanted to ask you, first of all, I read C.S. Lewis's biography, or a biography of C.S. Lewis, and it talked about him as a wartime apologist, that he actually rose to that role during the Second World War and sort of spoke out to the anxieties in Britain at the time. How did you end up a defender of the faith?
I come from a non-Christian family, not even a church-going family. So when I became a Christian, my third year in high school, I was immediately involved in having to explain to my non-Christian brother and friends why I had made this radical step. And so right from the very beginning, I was involved in giving reasons for faith. But then as I went to Wheaton College, which is a Christian liberal arts university, my interest in integrating faith and learning deepened. And I came to see that as a Christian, you don't have to put your brains in one pocket and your faith in the other pocket and never let them see the light of day at the same time. But rather, as a Christian, you can have a Christian world and life view. And it was there that I was captured by this vision of presenting the gospel in the context of giving a defense of the Christian world and life view.
Okay, now obviously this is not easy at times. So you've just done a debate in Brisbane with Lawrence Krauss, famous atheist, and is he a physicist or a...
He is a physicist. He's a particle physicist. He studies the fundamental particles that make up the material world.
So how do you find those sorts of debates, and how do you look after yourself in that sort of public
this was
setting?
supposed to be a dialogue and not a debate. It was supposed to be a conversation about, has science buried God? And this was an event sponsored by the City Bible Forum in Brisbane. And it was held in the City Hall. We had, I think, 1,700 people come out that evening. The place was absolutely sold out. But, and it was moderated by a representative from the ABC television network. Scott, yes. And Scott introduced the event in a very congenial way, that there's no reason to see science and religion as in opposition to each other. We can talk together and mutually explore these questions. And then Professor Krauss got up and he launched into the most vicious, vitriolic attack upon both God and upon me personally.
Wow.
So it turned out to be more like gladiatorial combat than a conversation. It was a remarkable evening.
All right, now I'm just thinking that we're recording the event tonight, so we'll take that little bit out, Chris.
Oh, I've already said that publicly. I mean, it was a barroom brawl.
Now, we've got a little quiz question to go here. It's actually from your book, Hard Questions, Real Answers. Now, in that book, you lament the fact that Christians, in particular, the wider population is ignorant of their history, events, famous things that have happened. They just are quite specialised often in what their knowledge, and even more so in the Christian world. So, here's the question according to the survey. I don't know whether you did this survey, but you certainly quote this survey. According to one survey's response, what was the name of Noah's wife? Would anyone like to have a go? Over here? Oh, you've read the book. Give the man a show bag. There's one left. You can just pick it up on your way out. All right. Now, how do you think workers defend the faith when they don't have a lot of discretionary time? So I'm thinking, you're in the lift and somebody turns to you and they say, "Oh, I heard that there was this big debate in Brisbane on the weekend with Lawrence Krauss, that you've only got 4 floors." We don't always have the luxury, if we're a worker, of being able to go into a cosmological argument. So.
Right. I like what the American apologist Greg Koukl says. He says, oftentimes the most you can do is just put a stone in someone's shoe. and let them then work through that shoe or that stone in the shoe. Let it bother them a little bit until you have a chance to talk again, and then you can advance the argument or the case. But just try to put a stone in his shoe maybe that first time you check.
That's very helpful, especially if we're in long-term relationships with people on the office floor of that.
Thank you very much. Well, I really am grateful to the City Bible Forum for having the vision to sponsor a series of dialogues like the 3 that I'm doing with Lawrence Krauss in Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne. I think this is a tremendous way of showing in the public arena that Christians have nothing to fear from the toughest critics of Christianity that are out there today, but that the Christian faith can stand intellectually head and shoulders above any other opposing philosophy or ism. And so I'm very, very grateful for your bringing Jan and me to Australia to be involved in these dialogues, and I'm glad to share this evening with you as well. I was asked to share some thoughts this evening on helping Christians to become everyday apologists. The Bible commands us always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you the reason for the hope that is in you. And so every Christian is to have an apologetic case or defense ready to give when called upon to do so. So how can we help equip Christians to be everyday apologists? Well, let me make 4 suggestions. Number 1, we need to teach them logic. We need to teach them logic. That is to say, we need to teach them the rules of logical inference. This will help them to construct valid arguments for God's existence, for what they believe, as well as to detect logical fallacies and missteps in the objections that are brought against the Christian faith. Now, this isn't really as difficult as it might sound. Did you know there are really only about 9 rules of logic that govern all reasoning? And so if you simply learn these 9 rules, you can then construct arguments based on them and spot inferences that objectors make that are invalid, that are not according to the rules. So I think we need, from a very young age, to be teaching our children and then our adults who don't know this as well, the basic rules of logic. Now, that raises the question as to what makes for a good argument. When I talk about presenting an argument, I don't mean quarreling. We should never quarrel or fight with an unbeliever. Rather, when a philosopher talks about an argument, he just means a set of statements leading logically to a conclusion. And I find that if you've got good arguments for what you believe, you will actually be less argumentative. There's just no reason to get hot under the collar when you've got good reasons for what you believe and good answers to unbelievers' questions. So what makes for a good deductive argument? Well, a couple of things. First of all, you have to have valid logic and true premises. That is to say, the conclusion needs to follow from the premises according to these 9 rules of logic, and then the premises need to be true. And if you have valid logic and true premises, you have what is called a sound argument. But that's not enough to be a good argument. A good argument must be more than merely sound. The premises of a good argument need to be related to the evidence in a certain way, such that the evidence makes it rational to believe the premises. And I would suggest that in a good argument, you will not only have valid logic and true premises, but these premises will also be more plausible in light of the evidence than their opposites, so that the rational person will believe the premise rather than deny it. Now, why is it important to have good arguments? Well, among our younger generation, there has been a tremendous increase in atheism and agnosticism in our day, partly as a result of the so-called new atheists, which are very aggressive. And often you will find, sadly and tragically, that these students who self-identify as atheists or agnostic come from Christian backgrounds, often from churches that have been extremely emotional and anti-intellectual in their worship style and teaching, and these students have walked away from Christianity because they think there's no good reason to believe in God. Now, when you talk to these folks, you find that they typically have no good reason for their atheism. They have no good argument against God. Rather, they will simply say to you, there's no evidence for God's existence. And this becomes almost like a slogan that is simply mindlessly repeated. There's no evidence for God's existence. And this serves effectively as a conversation stopper, because the average Christian has no arguments for God's existence. So when the unbeliever says, there's no evidence for God's existence, the Christian is speechless and has nothing to offer, and the conversation effectively ends. But if you have some good arguments for God's existence, then what you can do when the unbeliever says, there's no evidence for God's existence, your eyes should grow wide. You should look at him with surprise and say, is that what you think? Why, I can think of at least 5 arguments for God's existence. And then he's got to say, yeah, like what? And then you're off and running. So that rather than a conversation stopper, it becomes a conversation starter. Now, some people will say, oh, you can't argue someone into the kingdom of God. But where do these folks get the idea that when you present arguments for God, that you're working apart from or against the Holy Spirit? When we give arguments and evidences for God, we are trusting the Holy Spirit to use those arguments and evidence to open the minds of the unbeliever to his drawing and convicting power. I find that often the arguments will not be the reason that a person comes to believe in God, but what the arguments do accomplish is they give the unbeliever the intellectual permission to believe when his heart is moved. Because he thinks that good arguments exist for the existence of God, he can follow his heart when the Holy Spirit moves him to believe in Christ and the gospel, because he knows that he does not commit intellectual suicide in so doing. And the result of this is changed lives. Every week we get emails coming into our website at reasonablefaith.org of people who have come to Christ through these arguments, or who have come back to Christ after having walked away from Christian faith. Now, what are some of these arguments then for God's existence that I think we need to teach them? Well, you can find these arguments described in some detail in my books On Guard and Reasonable Faith. But they would include things like the cosmological argument. This is a very simple argument that every one of us can memorize. It goes like this: if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its existence. Something can't just come into being from nothing. So if the universe began to exist, the universe has a cause of its existence. 2, the universe began to exist. And here you can show or share philosophical arguments and scientific evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 13.7 billion years ago in this cataclysmic event called the Big Bang. So that mainstream science supports this premise that the universe began to exist. And from what follows from that is that therefore the universe has a cause. That is to say, there is an uncaused, beginningless, transcendent being beyond space, beyond time, who is therefore immaterial, enormously powerful, and has brought the universe into being. And that sounds something like God, doesn't it? Another argument that you can share is the argument for design. And the argument, as I formulate it, doesn't appeal to biological examples of design, but rather to the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, which were present right from the beginning in the Big Bang. And in that way, you do an end run around this whole emotionally poisoned debate over creation evolution, by showing that the initial conditions of the universe were fine-tuned for intelligent life. You show that life couldn't even evolve unless the universe were fine-tuned to an incomprehensible precision for the evolution and existence of intelligent life. So you can argue in the following way. Premise one, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise two is the universe is not due to physical necessity or chance. And in my published work, I share arguments against both of those alternatives, from which it follows three, therefore it is due to design. So this is a good design argument for a cosmic intelligence who has designed the universe and given the laws of nature their particular form. Now, neither of these first two arguments says anything about the moral character of the creator and designer. For all we know from these arguments, he could be an absolute stinker. But the third argument, the moral argument, tells us something about the character of this being. And this argument can be formulated in the following way. Premise one, objective moral values and duties exist. That is to say, in moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us as objectively binding and true. For example, we all recognize that it's wrong to walk into an elementary school with an automatic weapon and to shoot little boys and girls and their teachers. Premise two, if God did not exist, objective moral values would not exist. Many atheists as well as theists agree with this premise. If there is no God to serve as the transcendent anchor point for objective moral values and duties, then moral values and duties are just the byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning, and they have no objective validity. They're purely subjective. From those two premises, it follows logically that therefore God exists. So this gives us a locus and source of moral goodness and moral duty, who is behind the moral values that we apprehend. So those are just three examples of arguments for God's existence, each of which is easily memorizable, only 3 steps in each argument that you can share with a non-believer. Next, we need to teach them some evidence for the historical Jesus. The way you move beyond this general monotheism to Christian monotheism is by looking at the evidence for the person of Jesus of Nazareth. We need to be able to defend the historicity of Jesus' radical claims, to show that the historical Jesus believed himself to be and claimed to be the Messiah, the Son of God in a unique sense, and the Son of Man prophesied by the prophet Daniel, a divine human figure to whom God would give all judgment and authority, that all the peoples of the earth should worship and serve him. This is who Jesus of Nazareth took himself to be. And the confirmation of those radical claims comes through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. If God has raised this man from the dead, then that is the public and unequivocal vindication of those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. And the remarkable thing that I discovered as a result of my doctoral research in Germany on the resurrection is that the central facts undergirding Jesus' resurrection are largely agreed to in New Testament scholarship today. The majority of New Testament historians agree that after Jesus' death, Jesus' corpse was buried in a tomb by a man named Joseph of Arimathea. That on the Sunday morning following his crucifixion, that tomb was discovered empty by a group of his women followers. That thereafter various individuals and groups of people saw appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus despite every predisposition to the contrary. Those facts represent the mainstream conclusions of New Testament historical Jesus scholarship today. And my argument would be that there is no hypothesis that better explains those four facts than the one that the disciples gave, namely that God raised Jesus from the dead. So by presenting the historical credibility of the resurrection of Jesus, we can commend Christian theism as the brand of theism that is most plausibly true. Jesus is the absolute self-revelation of this creator and designer of the cosmos. So we need to teach our people logic, we need to teach them some arguments for God's existence, and we need to teach them some evidence for the historical Jesus. And then I think finally we need to teach them to share the arguments simply and effectively. I would encourage you to simply have a list of the arguments memorized. I found that often in dealing with unbelievers, you don't even need to explain the arguments. All you need to do is list them. For example, if you say, I can think of 5 arguments for God's existence, and the unbeliever says, yeah, like what? You can say, well, God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation of the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world. God is the best explanation of the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and God can be personally known and experienced. And I found that very often just listing them is enough to make the unbeliever sit back and say, yeah, I guess I really have to take this seriously. Now, if he does want to talk about any of them, I would encourage you to memorize the premises of those arguments and be able to write them out on a piece of paper or a napkin. If the universe began to exist, the universe has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Any of you can do that. A junior high school student can memorize these arguments and share them. So it's not difficult. Finally, I would encourage you to have some awareness of the evidence for these premises. Read a book like On Guard, for example, and at least familiarize yourself with some of the evidence for those premises. And then when you're sharing with an unbeliever, be ready to refer to a book for further discussion if you find that you get out of your depth. You can always say, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd be happy to refer you to a book where you can read more about this if you're interested. Never forget, finally, that our goal is ultimately to win people, not arguments. Don't let presenting arguments distract you from our primary goal of sharing the gospel. And so, in conclusion then, those would be the 4 things that I think we need to do to train people to be everyday apologists. Teach them logic, teach them some arguments for God's existence, teach them some historical evidence for Jesus, and finally teach them to share these arguments effectively.
If you'd like to take your seat now, we've got some great questions. Now, there were so many questions that Karen and I have got headaches trying to decipher them all. So we've actually tried to group them together, and if we haven't asked you a question, I'm sorry, but we've got 10 minutes and we're going to try and get through these. So, here we go. Bill, apart from the Bible, what has been the most influential book in your life? I think this is trying to think, what could you give somebody?
I think for me, it would probably be Alvin Plantinga's book, The Nature of Necessity. Plantinga was the spearhead of the contemporary renaissance of Christian philosophy in our day. And that book was tremendously influential in awakening a whole generation of young Christian philosophers.
Okay, and the name of the book again?
The Nature of Necessity.
Okay. Next question. The question is, what are the 9 rules of logic? I think they're thinking...
What are they?
What are the... Yes, but you gave us some of them, but...
Well, I didn't
9?
actually name any of them, but it would be things like modus ponens, modus tollens, disjunctive syllogism, conjunction, simplification. Those are the names of them. But what they would be things like this. If you have... Let these letters stand for sentences. If P... That's one sentence, implies Q, that would be another sentence. If P implies Q and P, therefore Q. That would be one rule of inference. So, for example, if it is Sunday, the library is closed. It is Sunday. What follows logically from that? The library is closed. And that follows by the rule called modus ponens.
And are those rules in your... which book?
Those are in Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, which is a kind of Christian introduction to philosophy, chapter 2.
Your book?
Mine and J.P. Moreland's, the co-author.
Okay. Next question. We have, if whatever begins to exist has a cause, what caused God?
God never began to exist, and therefore God doesn't need a cause.
Okay, there you go. Why should something exist rather than nothing? I.e., why God and the universe rather than no God and no universe? And they've said on the end, and I need something better than the ontological argument.
In order to explain why anything exists rather than nothing, you need to have something that is metaphysically necessary in its existence. That is to say, its non-existence is impossible. If everything is contingent, that is to say, it could have failed to exist, then you will never have an explanation for why there is anything rather than nothing. There has to be a metaphysically necessary being, which is the stopping point for this regress of explanations as to why something exists. And I would argue that that being is God.
Okay. All right, next one. What is the best approach when... well, I'll just fill in the question. What is the best approach with Muslims? Talking to Muslims.
I think in evangelizing Muslims, we focus upon the person of Jesus. Do not attack the person and character of Muhammad. That only gets their back up. I don't see any reason to attack the Quran. That makes them defensive. Focus is on the question, who is Jesus? Whom did he claim to be? And I love to share with Muslims the claims of Christ out of the New Testament. Witnessing to a Muslim is very, very much like witnessing to a Jehovah's Witness, because they accept the Gospels. So just point them to these sayings of Jesus that imply his divinity or deity. And a wonderful passage to do this is the parable of the vineyard in Mark, where, remember, the owner of the vineyard, after sending all the prophets, says, I have one left to send, my only beloved son. They will listen to my son. But instead they kill the son because he's the heir of the vineyard. Well, this is devastating for Islam, because it shows that Jesus is not just another in a long line of prophets. He is the Son of God and the end, the final messenger to Israel.
Okay. All right. Completely different question now. I find witnessing to homosexuals difficult because they often feel an immediate sense of oppression from Christianity. How do you share the gospel with people that have reasonable emotional difficulties in discussing Christianity?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I would simply try to focus on the objective evidence and say that if God does exist and is the source of our moral values and duties, then we need to do what he says. And so the question is there good evidence for the existence of God? And just focus on the evidence and not on trying to condemn them or their lifestyle or things of that sort.
Okay. And what about the evidence for Old Testament history? So you talked about New Testament resurrection. Dawkins says there is none or very little evidence for Old Testament history.
My strategy in evangelism is to defend what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity. That is to say, the central teachings that are affirmed by all the confessions of Christendom. And I think that that focuses upon two truths: the existence of God and his self-revelation in Jesus of Nazareth. So I don't argue with a non-believer about Old Testament history. It's irrelevant. If God exists and has decisively revealed himself in Jesus, then Christianity is true. And questions of historical reliability of the Old Testament, biblical inerrancy, those are in-house debates among believers. There's no reason to argue with an unbeliever about those kinds of things. We need to get them to first believe that God exists and then that he has revealed himself in Jesus.
Okay. And the question I tend to come across with my colleagues are less around God's existence scientifically and more to do with God's existence ethically. Questions like, if God exists, why do bad things happen? Any tips for responding to these sorts of questions?
This is a problem that is so existentially loaded that to give a soundbite now would do a disservice to the seriousness of that question. So let me simply refer you to places where I've discussed it at length. In my book called Hard Questions, Real Answers, there are 2 chapters where I really wrestle honestly with this problem of innocent suffering in the world. Or you could look again in Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, which has a long chapter on the problem of suffering. The bottom line is that I do not think that the suffering in the world makes it either improbable or impossible that an all-good and all-powerful God exists.
Okay. Now, I've got one. I'm going to sneak one in here. We're supposedly living in an age of postmodernism where people don't believe in truth. Right. They're all relative about truth. So how can we defend the gospel if we're coming up against that, particularly with the younger generation?
I think that it's a myth that we live in a postmodern culture. This is a myth which is perpetrated in our churches by misguided youth pastors. Nobody is a postmodernist when it comes to reading the labels on a bottle of aspirin and a box of rat poison. If you got a headache, you better believe that texts have objective meaning. So when you talk to folks, what they're pluralistic and relativistic about is not science, technology, and medicine. It's religion and ethics. But that's not postmodernism. That's modernism. That's old-line verificationism, which says if you can't verify it by your 5 senses, then it's just a matter of emotive expression or personal taste. So we live in a culture which remains deeply modernist at heart, and therefore we need to approach the truth of the Christian faith not merely by sharing our narrative, but rather by using the best arguments of logic and evidence to defend the objective truth of Christianity.
Okay, now you did use an example this morning of somebody in the business world who was able to convey a theological idea through their work.
Yes.
So could you share that?
I was communicating to the pastors today not to be afraid to teach their congregants theological terms. And the illustration I gave was when I was talking to an insurance agent once about Christ's substitutionary death for our sin. And he said, "Oh yeah, that's imputation." And I was shocked. I said, "How do you know this theological term?" And he said, "Oh, we use imputation all the time in the insurance industry." He said, "I can write a car policy such that if somebody drives your car and gets in an automobile accident, the responsibility for the accident will be imputed to you, even though you weren't driving the car." He says, "We use imputation all the time." So it underscored for me the fact that we as pastors shouldn't be apologetic about sharing with our congregants theological concepts and terms. If insurance agents can master them, you can master them.
All right, one last question here from someone. They are asking, have the counter-arguments to Christian faith ever made you question elements of your own beliefs, especially given that you're a public figure defending the faith?
Yes, I think that for example, as I shared today, the hiddenness of God is a powerful argument for the other side, that if God existed, why does he seem so silent sometimes, so hidden? This is a sort of version of the problem of suffering and evil. And I've tried to wrestle with this and give good responses to it. Lately, the last 10 years, I've been working on a very powerful philosophical objection to traditional theism, which is that God cannot be the sole ultimate reality because there are uncreated abstract objects that are independent of God's creation. And I'm thinking here of things like mathematical objects, like numbers and sets and functions, as well as things like properties and propositions, these abstract entities that are not part of the physical world, but many philosophers think exist. And these things are necessarily existent and uncreated if they are real. And so my current research project is to meet the challenge of this philosophy. It's called Platonism, and to show that, in fact, the view that God is the creator of all reality apart from himself is a defensible worldview.
Okay. Well, Bill is going to be continuing to debate in Melbourne, Sydney next week, and Melbourne as well. Different topics, but the same man, Lawrence Krauss, is that right?
That is correct, as well as a dialogue debate one evening with Peter Slezak of the University of New South Wales on the resurrection of Jesus. Okay. So I've got a couple of interlocutors coming up.
Well, we're going to pray in a minute, so remember to pray for those things as well for you. And certainly as a city, we'll be praying for you as you defend the faith on our behalf across our country. And if you want to see that debate, we're hoping that Lawrence Krauss will sign off on it being screened, being able to be screened. And you look like it's not going to happen, but I'm hoping it is. But we will do that in Adelaide on August the 20th if he signs off on it. And if you're interested in that, there are details of the venue. We thought we'd do it in a pub, and we thought it'd be an opportunity to bring your friends and have a pizza night and watch the show down that way. And we'll have a panel, and Reasonable Faith are going to help us out with that, as well as the Bible College of SA.
Very good.
So thanks so much for tonight, and please give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Good to be with you.